series of other things to help with cost. We focused on building the workforce in K-12 education and apprenticeships, in fab labs, in technical education, in our technical colleges, and the UW system as well. We talked about we've broken down barriers to help with whether it's helping train people coming out of the prison system, to welfare reform, to helping people with disabilities. And we've spent a lot of time focusing on talent attraction, particularly in the last year, with more people employed in the state than ever before. We just know now we can't afford to have anyone on the sidelines. We've got to get as many people into the workforce as possible and attract more people here, whether it's millennials from across the Midwest, whether it's looking at bringing alumni back home, or, as I mentioned at the podium as well, attracting military personnel about to retire and their families to come to the state. So we're pleased to be here today. One other thing I'll say as well, and then I'm sure you have some questions on the bills that are passed by the extraordinary session of the legislature. But one other thing that we're hoping will be resolved in the coming days, not necessarily a small business, but it does tie into small business in the sense that Kimberly-Clark has about 200 suppliers that they do business with from the state of Wisconsin. So there's a lot of small businesses that benefit from Kimberly-Clark. And my hope is Mark Hogan, our CEO at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, and his team have been doing a remarkable job. Obviously, I asked the legislature well before the November 6th election to come in and pass a bill in the Senate that had passed in the Assembly that would give us additional tools to keep Kimberly-Clark here in the state of Wisconsin and the Fox cities. Tremendously important in terms of the economic impact with all the really good paying family supporting jobs, the families that benefit from that, as well as I mentioned, the 200 some suppliers from across the state and the jobs associated with that. In the end, obviously the Senate didn't bring up the very thing I asked them to come in for. We were frustrated with that, but we're not giving up. If it's the last thing I do, quite literally, if it's the last thing I do over the next few weeks, we're going to find a way to save the jobs at Kimberly-Clark. We don't have a deal to announce yet, but we're cautiously optimistic we're heading in the right direction, and that's just critically important, more important to me than any of the other things that are pending in state government through the end of the year. It's about keeping those jobs here in the state and the long-term benefit that'll provide. So, take questions of that.
Governor, do you plan to sign the lame duck legislation?
Well, my priority right now is on Kimberly-Clark, so I've set aside anything else that would get in the way of that. Hopefully in the next few days we'll have something to announce about Kimberly-Clark. After that, I've asked my staff over the last week to do a full analysis. As you might guess, we called for the extraordinary session on, or asked them, we don't call for it, we call for special sessions, extraordinary sessions called by the legislature. We asked them to do an extraordinary session on the Kimberly-Clark bill. They obviously went off and did a series of other bills, which we didn't draft or ask for. They briefed us on those. Early on, I raised some concerns when they first talked about it, for example, an item that would have affected the veto authority. I would not have signed that. They did not include that in. They included language that was drafted without us being directly involved in that. So we're trying to sort through the details of that and make a determination. Right now, it looks most likely that we'll probably do a series, at least one, if not multiple, line item vetoes is what we're looking at most closely. But we'll have to wait and see. There's 3 different bills. Part of what one for sure we know has the ability to issue line item vetoes in because it has an appropriation. We believe at least one other of the bills, as we're looking with attorneys, could technically give the ability to do it, even though it doesn't have a direct appropriation because it deals with appropriations. It might give us an ability to do that, and one we believe doesn't give us any ability to do a line item veto. So our consideration is really looking at the specifics of what's in those packages. As I mentioned this morning, my criteria for the review of that's real simple. It's 4 categories. It's what will this do to improve transparency. I'll give you an example. One thing I'm interested in, one of the items that deals with transparency is they put a requirement that if the governor issues a felon or gives a pardon to a convicted felon or an early release, the governor in the future would be required to report that and provide notice of that. I think that's a pretty, it doesn't take away the legal authority for a governor to issue a pardon. I never did one, but constitutionally a governor can issue a pardon. Doesn't take away from doing that. It just says if you're going to do that, the public should be made aware of that. That's example, transparency. Second criteria is, I said, are there things that improve accountability? Another example of that is in years past, remember years ago, we talked about here and across the nation, the big multi-million-dollar tobacco settlements. This would say that if you have something like a multi-million-dollar settlement, the Attorney General still does the terms of a legal settlement, but once that money has been received, it suggests that the legislature should have some say in how that money is spent. Again, I think for accountability, most people would say that sounds like a fairly reasonable thing. It doesn't take away from the ability of the Attorney General to reach the settlement, reach the terms of it. It just says once the state receives that money, the legislature should have some say, particularly if you're talking about multi-millions. The third component is about protecting the taxpayers. It makes sense to want to protect the taxpayers in this. Good example of a provision that's in one of these bills says that a court decision, federal court decision, was announced earlier this year where the courts, in the case that South Dakota brought, said that if you tax something in state, if you have a sales tax on items purchased in the state, the same sales tax should apply to purchases made online in that state. Years ago, we changed the law that said if the federal government changed the law to allow that to happen, those proceeds should be used to lower income taxes across the board in the state of Wisconsin. The way it's drafted, that would apply only if the federal government changed the law in Congress, not if the federal courts ruled that. So this is a technical change, but it makes sure that taxpayers are protected in the same way they would have been had the Congress done it. And the fourth thing, to me, is about stability, maintaining stability in government. And a prime example of that is for 8 years, when we've asked for waivers from the federal government, I was not obligated by law, but by practice. I would work with the legislature to notify them and seek their input on waivers from the federal government for specific items. The reason I did that was just practical. It doesn't make any sense to get a waiver and then have the legislative branch object to it because the federal government won't likely give you waivers in the future if you can't get your legislature to go along with it. So the practice was we did things, asked for waivers of things we could actually get accomplished. One of the bills includes language that would ensure that the executive and legislative branch work together when they're seeking federal waivers. There are other things we're looking at. There's some concerns specifically we have about some issues dealing with Medicaid that we're going to look at that will probably be considered for a veto. There'll probably be an additional consideration if we can do this as part of what attorneys are giving us counsel on about, for example, the appointment of the head of the Economic Development Corporation, whether or not, what date that might be and what, if anything, can be done in that. Those are all things we're looking at right now. But again, until we get something resolved with Kimberly-Clark, that's my #1 priority.
So to confirm, Governor, your office does have the bills?
Do not. No, this is all information we're dealing off of that we got, like you all got information from the, I believe it's the Legislative Fiscal Bureau analysis and things of that nature.
Why haven't you
Did
called
you
for them
increase
yet?
of accountability as one of the criteria that you're going to be using to determine whether or not you're going to be signing these bills?
Those 4 things would be transparency, accountability, protecting the taxpayers, and, as I mentioned, stability.
Yes. Now, specifically with WEDC and the language for them to use audit spot checks and kind of business owners, you know, their own words and, you know, their own good word on whether or not they're creating jobs. How does that create?
No, that's not true at all. The head of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation will be more than happy to give you a great link. They already do an exhaustive effort right now. That is completely mischaracterized. That's not accurate at all in that assumption.
So the language in that bill would not then replace individual audits of businesses?
They still do a comprehensive report. It would change the way they do that. And again, I can let Mark Hogan's here if you want to talk to him after that.
He declined to comment on that specifically.
Okay, well, but he's talked about that, I think, with the Journal Sentinel and some others, yes, maybe the Associated Press yesterday. But that's a huge mischaracterization. There still is accountability measures. And remember, with any of these, part of what we're asking attorneys to look at is not just specific provisions, but if you have a bill where you can line on and veto things, then I can address a concern I might have with a line on veto, like I do in the budget. But if there's not an appropriation in, as I often do on other bills, I have to weigh, are there things I like and dislike, and what's the balance between the two out there? And so, for example, there are some things in terms of reports I raised concerns on in the past, on principle, on practice. None of them were very cumbersome. But if there are other things we like, even if there are things we vetoed in the past, those will have to be brought into consideration.
What are the early voting changes?
Are you confident whatever decision you do make on these bills will stand up to any potential legal challenge?
Absolutely. Remember the difference here, and again, there's huge misinformation out there. No matter what I do, I could veto everything, or I could sign it all, or I could do line on veto. No matter which of those three options I do, Tony Evers, come January 7th, will have some of the strongest powers of any governor in America. Just as I did, just as any governor does in the state of Wisconsin. Not only does the governor in the state of Wisconsin have a right to veto legislation, we have one of the strongest line-on vetoes of any governor in America. The governor can not only veto legislation, the governor actually has veto authority, for which they actually ask about renting in, and I said no, to even deal with things like 1310 hearings in front of the Joint Finance Committee and administrative financial issues. None of that goes away. The governor of Wisconsin will forever going forward, or at least until somebody else changes the law, but no matter what happens with these bills, the governor will continue to be able to appoint his or her cabinet. And the governor will continue to be able to appoint to boards and commissions. The governor will continue to be able to make appointments to sheriffs and district attorneys and judicial positions across the state. The governor of the state of Wisconsin will continue to be able to issue pardons. Will continue to be able to offer a biennial budget to be presented every 2 years. We'll continue to be able to offer every year a report to the joint session of the legislature on the state of the state. All those duties remain intact no matter what happens with the legislation. So for all this hype and hysteria, much of which I think is driven by fundraising for political purposes, the bottom line is there's not a fundamental shift in powers no matter what happens with this legislation. Read it. Just read it. There's not a fundamental shift out there. The powers remain no matter what. I could walk away and do nothing. I could let them go into law without acting on it. I could veto them. I could not veto them. It doesn't change. There's a lot of hype out there, particularly nationally. Don't believe the hype. Actually read what's in the legislation. That's what we're doing right now. We're not only reading it, we're asking our attorneys what options we have for potential line-on vetoes. And we're trying to actually determine what the impact of these things would be in terms of state policy. But it does not take away authority, and it clearly will not be, there'll be a challenge, no doubt. They've challenged just about everything we or lawmakers have done. So that'll be no surprise, and it wouldn't shock me if there's some extremely liberal judge in Dane County that will briefly uphold it. But once it gets into the other levels of the courts, I'm confident that anything that we put our stamp on, whether it's with a partial veto or not, will ultimately be upheld.
On the early voting limits,
your casting this series of bills is pretty tame, but your opponent, Tony Evers, talked to you about this and has called it a number of things and has ratcheted up some of the rhetoric around it. I want to know.
I'll give you a good example. I talked to him. I'll answer it. I talked to him on Thursday. I called him.
Yeah.
I asked for specifics. He brought up appointment of the position of economic development, which under the bill will happen. The question is, does it happen September 1st or does it happen after January 7th? That's one of the things we're looking at, if we can even veto or not, line on a veto. That's a consideration. He asked for that specifically. That had been brought up before. Other than that, he just said there's a lot of specific requests, there's a lot of things that he thought, having run the Department of Public Instruction, were challenges. I asked for what? He didn't give me any other examples. So to me, that's a prime example. When people ask me about this, I say, what do you object to? What specifically do you object to? Some of those things that people might object to, we're looking to see if we can actually do anything with those. Whether we do or not remains to be seen, but those are things we're specifically looking at. But overall, I hear phrases out there, but I actually tell people, read the bill. Actually look at what's in the bill. I didn't ask for it. I didn't draft it. But as governor, I'm obligated to at least consider anything, whether it's a Republican or Democrat legislature. And, you know, I'll add one other thing about this. Legacy. Since I've been governor, more than 94% of the bills I've signed into law, more than 94%. I don't recall more than once or twice hearing this in the media, but over 94% of the bills I signed into law had more than Republican votes. Our legacy isn't about an extraordinary session. Our legacy is about the fact that there are more people employed in the state of Wisconsin than ever before. that we've had 9 consecutive months of record low unemployment, that we've made a larger actual dollar investment in the schools than ever before, that our schools continue to have some of the highest graduation rates and some of the highest ACT rates in the nation, that we froze tuition 6 years in a row to make college more affordable at our University of Wisconsin campuses for in-state undergraduates, that we've helped over 30,000 people transition from welfare into the workforce, that we have some of the best ranked healthcare systems in the nation for quality, that unlike any governor before us, Democrat or Republican alike, for the first time ever, we've actually covered everyone living in poverty under Medicaid. Those are the things that our legacy will be judged on, and most specifically, with Act 10, we not only saved the taxpayers of the state over $8 billion, we got rid of seniority and tenure and now allow schools and local and state governments to employ people based on merit and hire people based on merit and pay them based on performance. That's been a tremendous turnaround in our schools and our local governments. That's what our legacy will be.
Do you worry that the final note of your 8 years as governor will be this controversial set of bills?
Actually, I'll give you a good example of this. The final note, no, I don't. I do not worry at all what the media says. I worry about what's doing right. My final note will be, just as I did on day one, on the last day of my term, I will always do what's right. No matter what pressure, no matter what attacks, no matter what editorials, I will not succumb to pressure from the media. I will do what is right. And that's why we're spending the time to do what's right. Not to buy into the hype, not to buy into the overplay, not to buy into the misinformation, but to actually do what is right. You may not always like it, you may not always agree with it, but in the end, we will always do what is right.
The early voting limits, do you think that's right? You encouraged your own supporters to do early voting, I think 43 days before the
Early
election.
voting is great, it just should be uniform. The idea that in some communities it's a couple weeks and other communities it's twice or 3 times as long, I think is a legitimate concern that people who live in communities where they're not able to afford to do longer early voting, I think it's reasonable to expect that early voting should be uniform. It does not get rid of early voting. There's nothing in the bills we've seen thus far that gets rid of early voting. It just says it should be early voting the same in every community across the state of Wisconsin. For over 150 years, people in this state had to vote on one day, election day. The only exception was if you were traveling, if you were physically incapable, either in a nursing home or in a hospital. We changed that years ago to open up early voting, but for more than a century and a half, it was limited to one day. We now say you can vote early, and all the legislature is asking for, as far as what I've read, I'll go back and look at it as we're reviewing all this, but as I see it and understand it, we don't have the physical documents here, but as we've seen in the analysis, it just says early voting should be uniform across the state of Wisconsin, so that voters in one jurisdiction don't have 2 or 3 times as much time to vote early as someone does in another jurisdiction. To me, that's about fairness. It should be only fair that if I live in a small town, I should have the same chance to vote early as someone who lives in a community of a different size or with a different financial means. Just because a community may not have the financial means shouldn't be a deterrent to them being able to have access to voting for the same amount of time.
All right, thank everybody.
You've said that the bills don't really do much in terms of stripping power from the incoming governor, but the Republican leaders have said we needed this to level the playing field in terms of checks and balances between the 2 branches of government. Do you think that was necessary? Would you have supported that if you were still going to be in office?
Well, again, I tell people to read the bill, no matter what they or anybody else says. When I look at the bills, I think the Associated Press actually did a pretty good analysis the other day on one of their fact checks and say there really isn't a whole lot there in terms, there isn't a fundamental shift. Again, some lawmakers had suggested going even further. When the idea, for example, was brought up about reining in the governor's power to have a veto over things like 1310 and other administrative actions, I said no, I would not support that. There's no way I would support that, because that would take power away from the governor. Having to tell people that you're issuing a pardon of a convicted felon, that doesn't take the pardon ability away. It just says you should let people know you're doing that. Saying when a multi-million-dollar settlement is given to the state of Wisconsin, it does not take away the legal authority, and there is no constitutional authority, because other than the creation of the Attorney General, there's nothing else in the Constitution about his or her duties. but the statutory authority. There's nothing that takes away the authority of the Attorney General to make a settlement over a legal issue. It just says if those multi-million dollars come into the state of Wisconsin, the 99 people in the Assembly and the 33 people in the state Senate, who we all duly elect, whether Republican or Democrat or some other party, should actually have something to say about tens of millions of dollars or more that might be coming into the state. So again, when I look at this, to me so far, I have not found anything that fundamentally shifts power away from the governor or from the Attorney General. It does have more issues regarding transparency, regarding accountability, certainly some actions that protect the taxpayers, and things that provide things that we've done as practice in working with the legislature to be codified, so some stability. But I've yet to find, for all the hype and hysteria out there, I've yet to find anything that fundamentally takes away the powers of the Attorney General or the governor. It makes for an interesting narrative, I guess, when you look at other states, but it's just not true here.
And your thoughts on your future,
Peter,
Governor?
What's that?
Your thoughts on your future? What are you going to do next? Do you know?
I'm going to come back to Milwaukee, and we've got, as you can imagine, a whole bunch of different offers. Some ideas we can consider now, some that we'd have to, after the election, to be compliant if those issues came up because of ethics issues. We have requirements, well, I won't get into all the legal issues, but to be compliant with all that, any of those things that involve people who lobby or principal, I don't know if we'll do any of that. What I won't do is I will not lobby. I made that clear. I'm not going to lobby. But we'll probably involve in a variety of different things. May do some speaking, may do some lecturing, maybe at a college or university. Probably will do some things. In particular, what I'm most specifically interested in is manufacturing. So I'd like to do things to help. I'd be interested in working with some small and mid-sized manufacturers in the state to help them grow, because as you heard me talk about today, that's been a particular passion of mine. And one of the things I've been very pleased to see grow in the state of Wisconsin has been manufacturing.
Just on timing really quickly, do you expect to use all the allotted time that the Constitution and your powers give you?
It all ties to Kimberly-Clark. To me, I can't stress enough, the reason we're not acting on any of this is because my priority is on Kimberly-Clark. It's why I asked the lawmakers to do an extraordinary session in the first place. It's frustrated me that they didn't give us the tools we needed then. And my focus is on saying, if, like I said, if I do nothing else, I'm going to find a way, I'm going to do everything in my power to find a way to save the jobs at Kimberly-Clark.
If you don't sign or veto, when would these extraordinary session bills kick in?
We haven't even considered that yet. So our hope would be, optimistically, is that in a reasonable amount of time we'll find a way to get to something with Kimberly-Clark, and then shortly thereafter we'll deal with this.
You don't anticipate not acting on them, though, do you?
No.
All right, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.